Behind the golden gates of Westmont Estate, where manicured gardens hide family secrets and crystal chandeliers illuminate decades of lies, a marriage built on political convenience is about to crumble. When security footage captures what was meant to remain hidden, the most powerful family in the nation faces their darkest hour. Some secrets are worth killing for, others are worth dying to protect. But when the cameras start rolling and the lawyers start circling, even the mighty fall. What happens when a woman who has everything discovers that everything she thought she knew was a lie? What price does power exact when the foundation it's built on turns to sand? In a world where image is everything and truth is a luxury few can afford, one clandestine meeting is about to destroy an empire that took generations to build. The gates of Westmont Estate have protected the Ashford family for over a century. Tonight, they become the walls of a prison that no amount of money or influence can unlock. The autumn rain hammered against the bulletproof windows of Westmont Estate as Margaret Ashford adjusted the diamond necklace that had belonged to 3 generations of women before her. The weight of it felt heavier tonight, as if the stones themselves carried the burden of every lie she had told, every smile she had forced, every moment she had pretended to be happy in a marriage that had died years ago. Richard Ashford, heir to a political dynasty worth over $2 billion, was somewhere in the mansion giving another interview about his upcoming gubernatorial campaign. His voice echoed from the grand ballroom where cameras captured his practiced charm, the same charm that had once swept her off her feet at Harvard 23 years ago. Back then, she had believed in the fairy tale. Back then, she thought love could survive anything, even the crushing weight of public life and family expectations. Now, as she watched the rain streak down the glass, Margaret knew better. Love didn't survive everything. Sometimes it suffocated slowly, day by day, decision by decision, until what remained was nothing but an elaborate performance for an audience that never stopped watching. Her phone buzzed against the mahogany surface of her antique desk. The message was brief, professional, exactly what she had expected. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Rose Garden Cafe. Come alone. We need to discuss your options. It was signed simply with the initials J.H. James Harrison was the best divorce attorney on the East Coast, perhaps in the entire country. He was discreet, ruthless, and expensive enough that only people like the Ashfords could afford his services. More importantly, he was the kind of lawyer who understood that some divorces weren't just about splitting assets, they were about survival. Margaret deleted the message immediately, a habit she had developed over the past 6 months as her marriage to Richard had deteriorated beyond repair. What had started as heated arguments behind closed doors had escalated into something darker, more dangerous. Richard's temper, once reserved for political opponents and business rivals, had begun turning toward her with increasing frequency and intensity. The bruise on her shoulder, hidden beneath the designer silk of her evening gown, was a week old and still tender. Richard had been careful, as always, to avoid places that photographs might capture. He was nothing if not methodical even in his cruelty. She closed her laptop and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The estate's security lights illuminated the sprawling grounds, revealing the army of guards that patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day. Richard called it protection. Margaret had begun to think of it as imprisonment. The sound of approaching footsteps in the marble hallway made her heart skip. She recognized the confident stride, the way Richard's Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor with military precision. He appeared in the doorway moments later, still impeccably dressed despite the late hour, his silver hair perfectly styled even after hours of television interviews. The interviews went well, he said without preamble, loosening his silk tie as he entered their shared study. The polls show us ahead by 12 points, and that's before the campaign even officially begins. Margaret turned from the window, forcing the practiced smile that had become second nature. That's wonderful, darling. I'm so proud of you. Richard studied her face with the calculating gaze that had served him well in business and politics. Everything about him was measured, controlled, from the way he spoke to the way he moved through a room. Even his spontaneity felt rehearsed. You look tired, he observed, moving to the bar cart and pouring himself 3 fingers of bourbon. Perhaps you should see Dr. Matthews again.
We can't have you looking unwell during the campaign season.
The suggestion felt more like a command. Another item on the endless list of requirements that came with being Mrs. Frame.
Richard Ashford. Look perfect. Speak carefully. Never show weakness. Never, under any circumstances, embarrass the family name. I'm fine, Richard. Just a long day. He nodded, but something in his expression suggested he didn't quite believe her. Richard had built his fortune by reading people, by detecting the smallest signs of deception or weakness. It was a skill that made him formidable in boardrooms and devastating in personal relationships. I've been thinking about the charity gala next week, she continued, desperate to redirect his attention. The one for children's literacy. And no. I thought perhaps we could announce our contribution to the scholarship fund. Excellent idea. Nothing plays better with suburban mothers than education initiatives. Richard finished his drink and set the crystal tumbler down with a soft clink. I'll have Sarah add it to my talking points. Margaret watched her husband of 23 years and felt the familiar chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. When had he become this person? When had every conversation become a calculation, every gesture a political strategy? Or perhaps the more unsettling question was whether he had always been this way, and she had simply been too young and too in love to notice. I think I'll turn in early, she said, moving toward the door. Tomorrow is going to be busy. Richard nodded absently, already reaching for his phone to check messages. Don't forget we have dinner with the senators on Friday. Wear the blue dress, the one with the high neckline. The specification wasn't random. The blue dress would cover the bruise on her shoulder just as the long sleeves she had taken to wearing covered the fingerprint marks on her wrists from last Tuesday's argument about campaign spending. Margaret climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, her hand trailing along the polished banister that had been carved by Italian craftsmen over a century ago. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashford men and their wives all smiling the same controlled smile that she had mastered over the years. In her private suite, she locked the door and moved to her walk-in closet, pushing aside evening gowns and designer suits until she reached the small safe hidden behind a false panel. Inside, along with her grandmother's jewelry and important documents, was a burner phone that Richard didn't know existed. She powered it on and scrolled through the contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Thomas Chen was a private investigator who specialized in cases involving wealthy families and sensitive situations. Margaret had hired him 3 months ago, not to investigate Richard's business dealings or potential affairs, but to document the abuse that she knew no one would believe without proof. The photographs Thomas had taken were damning. The recording device he had hidden in Richard's study had captured conversations that revealed the true nature of the man the public saw as their golden boy gubernatorial candidate. The evidence was enough to destroy Richard's political career and potentially land him in prison, but it was also enough to get Margaret killed. She typed a brief message to Thomas. Meeting tomorrow at 2. Need the package delivered by Friday. The response came back within minutes. Understood. Stay safe. Margaret powered down the phone and returned it to the safe, her hands trembling slightly as she spun the combination lock. In 3 days she would either be free of Richard Ashford or she would be dead. There was no middle ground in a marriage built on secrets and maintained by fear. As she prepared for bed, Margaret caught her reflection in the antique mirror that had belonged to Richard's grandmother. The woman staring back at her looked older than her 44 years, worn down by decades of pretending to be someone she wasn't. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen in years: determination. Tomorrow, she would meet with James Harrison and begin the process of ending her marriage to one of the most powerful men in the state. She would demand half of everything, including the family trust that Richard thought was untouchable. She would expose his abuse, his corruption, and his carefully constructed lies. She would also sign her own death warrant. But for the first time in years, Margaret Ashford felt truly alive. The performance was almost over, and soon she would discover what remained of the woman she used to be beneath all the roles she had played. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the last remnants of autumn and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in its place. Change was coming to Westmont Estate, whether Richard Ashford was ready for it or not. The only question was whether Margaret would survive long enough to see it. As she finally settled into bed, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a life without the constant surveillance, without the fear, without the need to calculate every word and gesture. It was a dangerous fantasy, one that could cost her everything if she wasn't careful. But as sleep finally claimed her, Margaret Ashford smiled for the first time in months. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end, and she was ready for whatever came next. In his study 3 floors below, Richard Ashford was having a very different conversation with a very different type of lawyer, the kind who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The game was about to begin, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The Rose Garden Cafe sat tucked between an antique bookstore and a small art gallery in the historic district, far enough from the political circles of downtown to offer genuine privacy. Margaret had chosen it precisely because no one from her usual world would think to look for her there. The exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture created an atmosphere that felt authentic in a way that her carefully curated life never did. She arrived 15 minutes early, ordering a simple coffee and claiming a corner table that offered clear views of both entrances. Old habits from her security briefings with Richard's team had taught her to always know her exits. Though she had never imagined she would need that knowledge to protect herself from her own husband, James Harrison arrived precisely on time, as she had expected. Everything about the man spoke of meticulous attention to detail, from his perfectly pressed charcoal suit to the way he scanned the room before approaching her table. He was younger than she had anticipated, perhaps 45, with the kind of sharp intelligence that showed in his eyes before he spoke. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, extending his hand as he sat across from her. "Thank you for meeting me here. I trust this location provides the privacy we both require." Margaret studied his face as they shook hands. James Harrison had built his reputation on discretion as much as skill, representing senators' wives, pharmaceutical heiresses, and technology moguls' ex-partners in divorces that could reshape entire industries. His track record was impressive, but more importantly, none of his clients had ever been found mysteriously dead in apparent accidents. "I need to know something before we begin," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the anxiety coursing through her veins. "Are you familiar with my husband's reputation beyond what you read in newspapers?" James leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "Mrs. Yester was yesterday. Ashford, I make it my business to know exactly who I'm dealing with before I take a case. Your husband is a very powerful man, with connections that extend far beyond state politics. He has resources at his disposal that most people can only imagine." He paused, studying her face carefully. "But I also know that you wouldn't be here if you weren't prepared to face those resources. So let me ask you directly, how far are you willing to go to end this marriage?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret thought about the bruises, about the threats that Richard delivered in his calm, measured voice, about the way he had begun isolating her from friends and family members who might ask uncomfortable questions. "All the way," she said finally. "Whatever it takes." James nodded slowly, reaching into his briefcase to extract a leather portfolio. "Then we need to discuss strategy. Your husband's wealth is largely tied up in family trusts and political entities that have been structured specifically to protect assets in situations like this. A conventional divorce proceeding would likely result in a settlement that leaves you with far less than you deserve." He opened the portfolio, revealing photographs and documents that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. The images showed Richard meeting with men she recognized as enforcers for the Castellano family, one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates on the East Coast. The documents detailed financial transactions that painted a picture of money laundering and political corruption spanning decades. "Where did you get these?" Margaret whispered. "I have my sources," James replied. "The question is whether you're prepared to use them. Because once we go down this path, there's no turning back. Your husband will use every resource at his disposal to destroy you, including resources that operate outside the law." Margaret stared at the photographs, her mind racing. She had suspected that Richard's business dealings weren't entirely legitimate, but the evidence before her suggested something much more sinister than simple tax avoidance or campaign finance violations. "He's been laundering money for the Castellanos," she said, more to herself than to James. "For over 15 years, according to our investigation, the construction contracts for his real estate development projects, the consulting fees paid to shell companies, even some of the donations to his political action committees. It's all connected." James gathered the documents and returned them to the portfolio. "Here's what I'm proposing. We file for divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences, which is standard and won't immediately raise red flags. Simultaneously, we prepare a comprehensive dossier, documenting both the financial crimes and the domestic abuse. If your husband attempts to contest the divorce or threatens you in any way, we release everything to federal prosecutors and the media." Margaret felt her heart pounding as she considered the implications. "You're talking about mutually assured destruction." "Exactly. Your husband is a calculating man who understands cost-benefit analysis. If we can convince him that fighting the divorce will cost him more than agreeing to a generous settlement, he'll make the rational choice." It was a sound strategy in theory, but Margaret knew her husband better than James Harrison did. Richard didn't make decisions based purely on rational calculations when his pride was involved. And divorce proceedings that could expose his criminal activities would definitely be about pride as much as money. "There's something else," she said, reaching into her purse for an envelope. "I've been documenting the abuse for months. Photographs, recordings, medical records from doctors who treated injuries I claimed were from accidents." James accepted the envelope and quickly reviewed its contents, his expression growing darker with each image. "Mrs. Ashford, some of these injuries could have been life-threatening. Why didn't you go to the police? Margaret almost laughed at the naivety of the question. My husband employs half the police force as private security when he's not in office. The other half owe their promotions to his political endorsements. Who exactly was I supposed to call? The reality of her situation seemed to sink in for James as he studied the photographs. This wasn't just a high-profile divorce. It was a case that could expose corruption reaching to the highest levels of state government. We're going to need protection, he said finally. I have contacts with federal agencies who might be interested in your husband's business relationships. If we can get you into witness protection, no. Margaret's voice was firm. I'm not spending the rest of my life hiding. I want my life back, not a new identity in some small town where I have to look over my shoulder forever. James nodded slowly, though she could see the concern in his eyes. Then we move fast, and we move decisively. I'll file the papers tomorrow morning. Once they're served, you'll have perhaps 48 hours before your husband's response escalates beyond legal maneuvering. He reached into his briefcase again, this time producing a small electronic device that looked like a combination phone and GPS tracker. This is a panic button connected directly to a private security firm that specializes in protecting high-risk clients. If you feel threatened in any way, press the red button and help will be on the way within minutes. Margaret turned the device over in her hands, marveling at how small it was. Such a tiny thing to stand between her and the considerable resources that Richard could bring to bear. What about the evidence of his criminal activities? She asked. When do we release that? We don't, unless we have to. The moment those documents become public, you become a target for people far more dangerous than your husband. The Castellanos don't leave loose ends, Mrs. Ashford. If they believe you're a threat to their operations, you didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret understood the implications perfectly. She was essentially blackmailing one of the most powerful political figures in the state, while simultaneously threatening to expose his connections to organized crime. If the strategy failed, she wouldn't just lose the divorce proceedings, she would lose her life. I need you to understand something, James continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. I've handled difficult cases before, but nothing quite like this. If you have any doubts, any hesitation at all, now is the time to walk away. Once we file those papers, events will move very quickly. Margaret thought about the previous night, about the way Richard had looked at her when she mentioned being tired. There had been something calculating in his expression, as if he were already planning her removal from his life, through means other than divorce. File the papers, she said. I'll deal with whatever comes next. James nodded and began packing his briefcase. I'll need you to stay somewhere safe for the next few days. Do you have family or friends who live outside the state? My sister lives in California. But Richard monitors my communications, my credit cards, everything. He'll know if I try to leave town. Then we'll use that to our advantage. I want you to behave normally for the next 24 hours. Go to your scheduled appointments, attend any social functions, maintain your usual routine. Don't give him any reason to suspect that changes are coming. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. After months of careful planning, after gathering evidence and building her case, success would depend on her ability to continue the performance that had defined her marriage for over 2 decades. As they prepared to leave the cafe, James handed her a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. This connects to a secure line that I monitor 24 hours a day. If anything happens, anything at all, call me immediately. Margaret slipped the card into her purse alongside the panic button. These small talismans of hope in what felt increasingly like a war she might not survive. Mr. Harrison, she said as they stood to leave, can I ask you something? Why did you take this case? You could represent anyone. Why risk your reputation and possibly your safety for me? James was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Because 23 years ago, I watched my mother stay in an abusive marriage because she was afraid of what would happen if she left. She died in what the police called an accident, but I knew better. I've spent my career making sure other women don't have to make that choice. The confession hung between them as they walked toward the cafe's exit. Margaret realized that James Harrison wasn't just her lawyer, he was her ally in a battle that had claimed casualties long before she ever entered the fight. Outside, the autumn air felt crisp and clean after the morning rain. Margaret could almost imagine that she was simply a woman meeting a friend for coffee, that her biggest concern was choosing what to wear to dinner that evening. But as she walked back to her car, she noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street when she arrived was still there, its occupants obscured by tinted windows. Richard's security team, or something more sinister, She couldn't be sure. One thing was certain, the clock was already ticking, and tomorrow everything would change. As Margaret drove back toward Westmont Estate, she allowed herself one last look at the woman she had been for the past 23 years. By this time tomorrow, that woman would cease to exist. What emerged from the ashes would either be free or dead, but it would finally be authentic. The game had begun, and there could be only one winner. The call came at 6:47 in the morning, jolting Margaret from the first peaceful sleep she'd experienced in months. The caller ID showed only a number she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Mrs. Ashford, this is Detective Rodriguez with the State Police. I'm calling to inform you that there was an incident last night involving James Harrison, the attorney you met with yesterday afternoon." Margaret sat up in bed, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear the detective's words over the rushing sound in her ears. "What kind of incident?" "Mr. Harrison was found in his car early this morning. It appears to be a single-vehicle accident, but we're conducting a full investigation. I'm sorry to inform you that he didn't survive." The phone slipped from Margaret's trembling hand, clattering onto the marble floor of her bedroom. Through the fog of shock and terror, one thought cut through with crystal clarity. Richard knew about the meeting. She scrambled to retrieve the phone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold it steady. "Detective, was there anyone else injured? Were there any witnesses?" "No other vehicles were involved, ma'am. Are you all right?" "You sound upset." Upset. The word seemed absurdly inadequate for the terror coursing through her veins. James Harrison had been killed less than 18 hours after their meeting, and the police were calling it an accident. In Richard's world, there were no coincidences, only carefully orchestrated events designed to look like coincidences. "I'm fine," she lied. "Thank you for calling." Margaret ended the call and stared at her phone, trying to process the implications of what had just happened. James Harrison was dead, which meant all of their plans, all of the evidence he had gathered, all of the protection he had promised, had died with him. She was completely alone. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom sent a spike of pure terror through her chest. Richard's morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. Exercise at 5:30, shower at 6:15, breakfast at 7. He was never on this floor at this time unless something was wrong. The knock on her door came soft but insistent. "Margaret, I thought I heard you talking to someone." She forced her voice to remain steady as she called back. "Just checking my schedule with Sarah. I'll be down for breakfast in a few minutes." "Actually, I was hoping we could talk now. I have some news that might interest you." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She could hear the satisfaction in Richard's voice, the tone he used when he was particularly pleased with himself. He was enjoying this. "Of course, darling. Just let me put on a robe." She moved to her closet with forced casualness, her mind racing as she tried to figure out her next move. The panic button James had given her was hidden in her jewelry box, but reaching for it would require crossing the room in full view of the door. If Richard was watching her through the security cameras that monitored every room in the house, any suspicious behavior could be her last. Instead, she selected a silk robe and tied it carefully around her waist, buying herself precious seconds to think. The evidence that James had shown her the day before was presumably in his office or his home, both of which would be searched by Richard's people within hours if they hadn't been already. She opened the bedroom door to find Richard standing in the hallway, still dressed in his workout clothes but showing no signs of exertion. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his expression calm and controlled as always. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the east wing of the house. "I want to show you something." Margaret had no choice but to follow, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. Richard led her through corridors lined with priceless artwork and family portraits, past rooms filled with antiques that had been collected over generations of Ashford wealth and power. They ended up in Richard's private study, a room Margaret rarely entered uninvited. The walls were lined with leather-bound books and framed photographs documenting Richard's rise through the worlds of business and politics. Behind his massive oak desk, a wall-mounted television displayed the morning news with the sound muted. "Sit," Richard commanded, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Margaret remained standing. "What's this about, Richard?" Her husband moved to stand behind his desk, his hands resting on its polished surface as he studied her face with those calculating eyes. "I received some disturbing news this morning. It seems there was a terrible accident involving a prominent attorney. Perhaps you heard about it?" The question was delivered with such casual cruelty that Margaret felt her knees weaken. Richard knew exactly what he had done, and he wanted her to know that he knew she knew. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. Richard smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. James Harrison. Excellent reputation, very discreet, specialized in high-profile divorce cases. Ring any bells? Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze. Should it? Well, that depends. You see, I have security footage of you meeting with Mr. Harrison yesterday afternoon at a charming little cafe in the historic district. The Rose Garden, I believe it was called. The blood drained from Margaret's face as the implications hit her. Richard's security team hadn't just been watching the cafe. They had been recording everything. Every word, every document James had shown her, every detail of their escape plan had been captured on camera. I don't know what you think you saw. Oh, I know exactly what I saw. Richard opened a laptop on his desk and turned it toward her. The screen showed crystal clear footage of her and James sitting at their corner table, their heads bent together in obvious conspiracy. Audio quality isn't perfect, Richard continued conversationally, but my technicians were able to enhance most of your conversation. Very interesting discussion about federal prosecutors and witness protection programs. Margaret felt the last of her hope crumble. Not only had Richard known about the meeting, he had evidence of everything they had discussed. The recordings could be edited to make her appear to be the one attempting to blackmail him, rather than the victim trying to escape an abusive marriage. The really fascinating part, Richard said, closing the laptop with a soft click, was watching Mr. Harrison show you those photographs, the ones of me meeting with certain business associates. I have to admit, I was impressed by the quality of his surveillance work. He moved around the desk to stand directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the faint scent of violence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Where are the originals, Margaret? The question was delivered in the same tone he might use to ask about dinner plans, but Margaret could see the fury burning behind his controlled exterior. This was Richard at his most dangerous, when his rage was cold and calculated rather than hot and explosive. I don't know what you're talking about. Richard's hand moved so quickly that Margaret barely saw it coming. The slap sent her stumbling backward, her cheek burning from the impact. Wrong answer, he said calmly. Let me rephrase the question. Where are the photographs and documents that could implicate me in activities that might interest federal investigators? Margaret touched her stinging cheek, tasting blood where her lip had split. James never gave me anything. We only talked. This time, Richard's backhand sent her sprawling across the Persian rug, stars exploding behind her eyes as her head struck the corner of a coffee table. I'm going to ask you one more time, Richard said, standing over her as she struggled to sit up. And I want you to think very carefully about your answer, because your life depends on getting this right. He crouched down beside her, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. I know you have copies of those documents. I know you were planning to use them against me. What I don't know is where you've hidden them. But I promise you this, I will find out one way or another. Margaret could feel blood trickling down her forehead from where she had struck the table. The room seemed to spin slightly, but her mind was becoming clearer rather than more confused. She was going to die in this room, unless she found a way to escape. The documents are in a safety deposit box, she lied, at First National Bank downtown. James insisted on keeping them somewhere secure. Richard studied her face for signs of deception. Which box? What's the number? Box 247. James had the key. It was a reasonable lie, the kind of precaution that a cautious attorney might take. More importantly, it would buy her time while Richard's people searched James Harrison's possessions and found nothing. Richard stood up and walked back to his desk, picking up his phone. Michael, it's Richard. I need you to make some inquiries at First National Bank. Safety deposit box 247. Find out who has access and get me inside that box within the hour. As he spoke, Margaret's eyes found the letter opener on Richard's desk, its silver blade gleaming in the morning light streaming through the windows. It was only 8 inches long, but it might be enough if she could reach it without him noticing. There's something else we need to discuss, Richard said after ending his call. Your sudden interest in ending our marriage. He opened a desk drawer and withdrew a document that Margaret recognized with growing horror. It was a divorce petition, already filled out and ready for filing. Did you really think I wouldn't know? Richard asked, his voice filled with mock disappointment. Did you believe you could plan my destruction without me being aware of every move you made? Margaret realized that she had never had any control over the situation. From the moment she had decided to leave Richard, he had been watching, planning, always staying one step ahead. Here's what's going to happen, Richard continued, moving around the desk again. You're going to tell everyone that James Harrison was helping you plan a surprise fundraising event for my campaign. His unfortunate death was a tragic accident that has left you too distraught to continue with public appearances. He grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. You will play the grieving friend, the devoted wife standing by her husband during a difficult time. And if you even think about deviating from that script, you'll join Mr. Gore, Harrison, in whatever afterlife awaits people who betray me. Margaret tried to pull away, but Richard's grip tightened. Do you understand me? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Now clean yourself up and get dressed. We have a campaign event at noon, and I need my devoted wife by my side, smiling and waving for the cameras. Richard released her and returned to his desk, dismissing her with the casual cruelty that had defined their relationship for years. But as Margaret slowly got to her feet, she noticed something that gave her the first spark of hope she had felt since learning of James Harrison's death. The panic button was still in her jewelry box upstairs, and Richard didn't know it existed. James Harrison might be dead, but his final gift might still save her life. She just had to survive long enough to use it. As she walked toward the door, Margaret caught a reflection in the antique mirror hanging on the study wall. The woman looking back at her was bruised and bloodied, but there was something in her eyes that Richard had missed in his moment of triumph. She wasn't beaten yet, and a woman with nothing left to lose was far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. The game was entering its final phase, and Margaret Ashford was about to show her husband exactly what 23 years of fear and rage could accomplish when properly motivated. 7. The makeup artist worked with practiced efficiency, covering the bruises on Margaret's face with layers of concealer and foundation that transformed her from victim to political wife in less than an hour. The woman, whose name was Claire, had been working with the Ashford family for 8 years and had become expert at making certain types of injuries disappear for public appearances. Mrs. Ashford, you'll want to avoid touching the left side of your face today, Claire said quietly as she packed her supplies. The concealer will hold for several hours, but direct contact could disturb it. Margaret nodded, studying her reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at her appeared poised and elegant, every inch the supportive political spouse. No one would guess that less than 2 hours earlier, she had been bleeding on her husband's study floor. Thank you, Claire. Same time next week? It was a routine question, one they had exchanged dozens of times before. But this time, Claire hesitated before answering. Ashford, if you ever need alternative assistance, there are people who can help. People who understand situations like yours. The offer was delivered so quietly that Margaret almost missed it. She met Claire's eyes in the mirror and saw understanding there, the recognition of one woman who knew exactly what another woman was enduring. I appreciate that, Claire, more than you know. After Claire left, Margaret sat alone in her dressing room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and privilege that had become her prison. Designer gowns hung in perfect rows, jewelry worth more than most people's homes glittered in climate-controlled cases, and photographs documenting 2 decades of public appearances lined the walls. In every image, she was smiling the same controlled smile, standing beside Richard with the practiced ease of a professional actress. The woman in those photographs looked happy, fulfilled, blessed with a life that millions of people envied. Margaret wondered if anyone had ever looked closely enough to see the fear in her eyes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard's campaign manager. Mrs. A, we need you downstairs in 10 minutes for the ride to the Veterans Center. Press will be heavy today, so please remember the talking points we discussed. The talking points. Margaret almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Even her grief over James Harrison's death had been scripted, focus grouped, and optimized for maximum political impact. She rose from the vanity chair and walked to her jewelry box, her heart racing as she reached for the small device James had given her. The panic button felt warm in her hand, its red activation switch covered by a small safety cap that she could remove with her thumbnail. Margaret slipped the device into the hidden pocket of her designer suit jacket, the weight of it a small comfort against the terror that had become her constant companion. She had no illusions about what would happen if she used it. Richard's security team was always close enough to intervene before outside help could arrive, and activating the device would only accelerate whatever timeline he was working with for her elimination. But knowing she had options, even limited ones, gave her the courage to continue the performance for a little while longer. Downstairs, Richard was waiting in the marble foyer, flanked by 3 members of his personal security team. He had changed into a navy blue suit that photographed well and projected the right combination of authority and approachability that focus groups preferred in their gubernatorial candidates. Margaret, you look lovely, he said, his voice carrying the warmth that charmed voters and business partners alike. To anyone watching, they appeared to be a devoted couple preparing for another day of public service. Thank you, darling. I'm looking forward to meeting the veterans today. The words felt like ash in her mouth, but Margaret had long ago mastered the art of saying what was expected while feeling nothing at all. Richard's senior aide, Sarah Chen, approached with a tablet displaying the day's schedule. "Sir, we have the Veterans Center from noon to 1:30, followed by a brief media availability. The afternoon includes meetings with potential donors, and the evening fundraising dinner starts at 7. Any changes to the guest list for tonight?" Richard asked, his attention focused on the tablet screen. "Yes, sir. Due to the unfortunate accident involving Mr. Harrison, we've had to make some adjustments. Several attendees have expressed their condolences and asked about memorial arrangements."
Margaret felt Richard's eyes on her as Sarah spoke.
The death of James Harrison was being woven into the campaign narrative as a tragic loss that demonstrated the couple's resilience during difficult times. "I think we should establish a scholarship fund in James's honor," Margaret said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Something focused on providing legal aid to people who can't afford proper representation." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment. Richard's expression remained neutral, but Margaret could sense his amusement at her small act of rebellion. "What a thoughtful idea," he said finally. "We'll have Sarah look into the details." It was a perfect political response. Acknowledge the suggestion with enough enthusiasm to seem engaged, but commit to nothing specific enough to create actual obligations. The limousine ride to the Veterans Center passed in strategic silence. Richard reviewed notes on his tablet while Margaret stared out the bulletproof windows at the city that had been her home for over 2 decades but had never felt less familiar. The neighborhoods they passed through told the story of Richard's political career in stark visual terms. The affluent areas near Westmont Estate were meticulously maintained, their parks well-funded and their infrastructure modern. But as they moved toward the Veterans Center in the older part of the city, the streets showed signs of the budget cuts and delayed maintenance that had defined Richard's approach to governing. Margaret found herself wondering how many people in those neglected neighborhoods knew that their tax dollars had been diverted to projects that benefited Richard's business associates and political donors. How many veterans struggling with inadequate health care and limited benefits understood that their suffering subsidized the Ashford family's lifestyle? The Veterans Center itself was a study in institutional neglect, its exterior showing the kind of deferred maintenance that spoke of chronic underfunding. But inside, the staff had worked miracles with limited resources, creating a warm and welcoming environment for the men and women who had sacrificed so much in service to their country. Margaret watched Richard transform as they entered the main hall. The calculating politician disappeared, replaced by a man who seemed genuinely moved by the stories of service and sacrifice that surrounded them. His interactions with the veterans appeared authentic, his interest in their struggles real rather than performed. It was moments like these that reminded Margaret why she had fallen in love with him all those years ago. Richard possessed a rare ability to make people feel heard and valued, to project empathy and understanding even when his actions suggested otherwise. But Margaret had learned to recognize the performance for what it was. Richard wasn't moved by the veterans' stories. He was cataloging which narratives would play best in campaign advertisements and which individuals might be willing to appear in testimonials. During the media availability that followed their tour, Margaret stood beside her husband and smiled as he fielded questions about veteran affairs, healthcare policy, and economic development. She nodded at appropriate moments and maintained the kind of engaged but deferential posture that polling data suggested voters preferred in political spouses. "Mrs. Ashford," called a reporter from the back of the room, "there are rumors that you've been meeting with divorce attorneys. Can you comment on the status of your marriage?" The question hit like a physical blow, stopping all conversation in the room. Margaret felt every camera lens focus on her face as she struggled to maintain her composure. Richard's hand found her shoulder, the gesture appearing supportive to observers but carrying an unmistakable message of warning. His fingers pressed into the tender spot where he had grabbed her earlier, a reminder of what would happen if she deviated from the script. "My wife and I have been happily married for 23 years, Richard said, his voice carrying just the right note of dignified offense at the suggestion. "We're focused on serving the people of this state, not responding to malicious gossip. Mrs. Ashford, would you like to respond personally?" Margaret looked directly into the camera as she spoke, knowing that Richard would analyze every word and gesture for signs of betrayal. "My husband and I are completely committed to each other and to his vision for our state's future. Any suggestion otherwise is simply false." The lie came easily after years of practice, but Margaret could taste its bitterness. Somewhere in the viewing audience was James Harrison's family, mourning the loss of a good man whose only crime had been trying to help her escape. As they left the Veterans Center, Richard's grip on her arm was tight enough to leave bruises. "That was well handled," he said quietly. "But I'm curious how that reporter came to ask that particular question." Margaret's blood ran cold. "I have no idea." "Of course not. But perhaps we should discuss limiting your interactions with the media for the remainder of the campaign, just to avoid any further confusion." It was phrased as a suggestion, but Margaret understood it as the order it actually was. She was being isolated even further, cut off from any potential avenue of escape or assistance. The afternoon meetings with donors passed in a blur of handshakes and carefully scripted conversations. Margaret played her role perfectly, charming potential contributors with the kind of gracious warmth that made them feel like cherished friends rather than sources of campaign funding. But as the hours passed, she became increasingly aware of the security team's positioning around her. What had once felt like protection now clearly revealed itself as containment. She was never alone, never out of sight of at least one of Richard's people, never in a position where she could make a phone call or send a message without being observed. During a brief bathroom break between meetings, Margaret found herself alone for the first time all day. She quickly activated her phone and scrolled through her contacts, looking for someone, anyone, who might be able to help. But as she looked at the names and numbers, she realized that Richard had been systematically isolating her for years. Her friends were all connected to his political and business circles. Her family members had been gradually pushed away through a series of manufactured conflicts and misunderstandings. There was no one she could call who wouldn't ultimately report back to Richard. The bathroom door opened and Sarah Chen entered, her expression apologetic but firm. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband is asking for you. The next group of donors is ready to begin." Margaret pocketed her phone and followed Sarah back to the conference room, where Richard was holding court with a group of businessmen whose industries had benefited substantially from his policy decisions. As the evening wore on, Margaret began to understand that this was her life now. An endless series of performances, each one monitored and evaluated, each deviation from the script noted and punished. But she also began to formulate a plan. If she couldn't escape during the day when security was heaviest, she would have to wait for night. The fundraising dinner would end around 10 o'clock, followed by the usual post-event analysis and planning session that could last until midnight or later. Richard would expect her to retire to a room afterward, exhausted from the day's performances and in no condition to cause trouble. It would be the perfect time to activate the panic button and hope that James Harrison's people were as reliable as he had promised. As Margaret smiled and nodded through another conversation about tax incentives and regulatory reform, she allowed herself to imagine what freedom might feel like. In a few hours, she would either be dead or finally free. Either outcome was preferable to spending another day as Richard Ashford's perfectly controlled political wife. The countdown to her liberation had begun. The fundraising dinner at the Grandview Hotel was proceeding exactly as planned. Margaret had perfected the art of working a room full of wealthy donors, moving from table to table with practiced grace, while Richard delivered his carefully crafted speech about vision, leadership, and the future of the state. She smiled and nodded as Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, the wife of a prominent pharmaceutical executive, described her latest charity work with underprivileged children. The conversation was the kind of meaningless social interaction that filled Margaret's days, but tonight it felt different. Tonight every word might be among the last she would ever speak as Richard Ashford's wife. "You seem distracted this evening, dear," Mrs. Pemberton observed, her sharp eyes studying Margaret's face with the kind of attention that came from decades of navigating high society politics. "Is everything quite all right?" "Just tired," Margaret replied, touching the spot on her cheek where Claire's makeup concealed the bruising from that morning's beating. "It's been a long day." "Of course. Your husband works you far too hard, in my opinion. A woman needs time for herself, don't you think?"
The comment was innocent enough, but something in Mrs.
Pemberton's tone suggested deeper understanding. Margaret found herself wondering how many political wives in this room were living variations of her own nightmare, trapped by wealth and public image in marriages that had become elaborate prisons. Across the ballroom, Richard was concluding his remarks to thunderous applause. He caught Margaret's eye and gestured almost imperceptibly toward the exit, their prearranged signal that it was time to begin the post-event meet-and-greet session with major donors. "If you'll excuse me," Margaret said to Mrs. Pemberton. "Duty calls?" "Of course, dear. But remember what I said about taking time for yourself. Sometimes a woman has to make difficult choices to protect her own well-being." The words followed Margaret as she made her way through the crowd toward her husband. "Mrs. Ben!" Pemberton couldn't possibly know about Margaret's situation, but the comment felt like a benediction, a reminder that she wasn't the only woman who had faced impossible choices between safety and freedom. The private reception for major donors took place in the hotel's presidential suite, a lavishly appointed space that offered stunning views of the city skyline. Margaret played her role perfectly, charming potential contributors, while Richard worked the room with the skill of a master politician. But as the evening progressed, she became increasingly aware of time slipping away. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and the security team would expect her to return to Westmont Estate within the hour. Once she was back in the mansion, surrounded by Richard's people and the electronic surveillance that monitored every room, her chances of escape would drop to zero. During a brief lulling conversation, Margaret excused herself to use the restroom. The hotel's ladies' room was elegantly appointed, with marble countertops and golden fixtures that reflected the soft lighting in a way that almost made her bruised face look healthy. She locked herself in the largest stall and carefully removed the panic button from her jacket pocket. The device felt heavier than she remembered, its weight seeming to increase with the magnitude of what she was about to do. Margaret removed the safety cap with trembling fingers, exposing the red activation switch that would either save her life or end it. Once she pressed that button, there would be no going back. Richard would know immediately that she had betrayed him, and his response would be swift and final. But the alternative was returning to Westmont Estate and accepting whatever fate Richard had planned for her. Based on James Harrison's sudden death and the escalating violence of that morning's confrontation, Margaret had no illusions about her long-term survival prospects if she remained passive. She closed her eyes and pressed the button. The device emitted no sound, gave no indication that her desperate plea for help had been transmitted. Margaret returned it to her pocket and flushed the toilet, maintaining the pretense of normalcy even though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. When she emerged from the stall, she found herself face-to-face with Sarah Chen, Richard's senior aide, who was standing by the sinks with an expression of barely concealed suspicion. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband was asking for you. The evening is winding down, and he'd like to begin the drive back to the estate." Margaret forced a smile as she washed her hands, trying to project the kind of exhausted resignation that would be expected after such a long day. "Of course. I was just touching up my makeup." Sarah's reflection in the mirror was watching Margaret's every movement, cataloguing any behavior that deviated from the norm. Margaret realized that the security team had probably been monitoring her all evening, timing her bathroom breaks and noting any conversations that lasted longer than appropriate. They returned to the reception together, where Richard was saying his goodbyes to the last group of donors. He looked up as Margaret approached, his smile warm and genuine seeming, but she could see the calculation in his eyes as he assessed her demeanor. "There she is," he said, slipping an arm around her waist in a gesture that appeared affectionate but felt possessive. "I was just telling the Hendersons about your idea for the scholarship fund in James Harrison's memory." Margaret nodded and smiled, playing her part while silently counting the minutes since she had activated the panic button. James had promised that help would arrive within minutes, but she had no way of knowing if his people had been watching the hotel, or if they would even be able to reach her through Richard's security cordon. The elevator ride down to the hotel's main floor felt endless. Richard stood beside her in comfortable silence, scrolling through messages on his phone, while two members of his security team flanked them with the kind of casual alertness that suggested they were prepared for trouble. In the hotel lobby, Margaret caught sight of a familiar face that made her pulse quicken. Thomas Chen, the private investigator she had hired months earlier, was sitting in one of the leather armchairs near the concierge desk. Apparently absorbed in reading a newspaper, their eyes met for just a moment, and Thomas gave an almost imperceptible nod before returning his attention to the paper. Margaret felt a surge of hope. If Thomas was here, it meant that James Harrison's network was still operational despite his death. The limousine was waiting in the hotel's circular driveway, its engine running and rear door held open by Richard's lead security officer, a man named Marcus Webb, who had been with the family for over a decade. As they settled into the leather seats, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "I need to take this," he said, activating the car's privacy partition before answering. "What do you mean there's a problem?" Margaret couldn't hear the voice on the other end of the call, but she could see Richard's expression growing darker as the conversation continued. "When did this happen?" Richard asked, his voice taking on the cold edge that Margaret knew preceded violence. "How many people know about it?" The limousine pulled away from the hotel, but instead of turning toward Westmont Estate, it headed in the direction of downtown. Margaret felt her anxiety spike as she realized they were deviating from their usual route. "Change of plans?" Richard said after ending his call. "We need to make a quick stop at the office." The Ashford Group's headquarters occupied an entire city block, its gleaming glass facade rising 37 floors above the financial district. At this hour, the building should have been empty except for security guards and cleaning crews, but Margaret could see lights on in several upper-floor offices. Marcus Webb escorted them through the lobby to a private elevator that accessed only the top 5 floors of the building. As they rose toward Richard's executive suite, Margaret caught her reflection in the polished steel doors and saw a woman who looked terrified despite her composed exterior. The elevator opened directly into Richard's office, a vast space that occupied half of the top floor and offered panoramic views of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Despite the late hour, several men were waiting in the sitting area, their faces grim as they looked up at Richard's arrival. Margaret recognized 2 of them from the photographs James Harrison had shown her, Vincent Castellano and his lieutenant, a man known simply as Torino. The presence of organized crime figures in Richard's office confirmed her worst fears about the extent of her husband's criminal connections. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his tone carefully neutral, "I understand we have a situation that requires immediate attention." Vincent Castellano was a small man with silver hair and dead eyes who commanded respect through reputation rather than physical intimidation. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of making problems disappear. "Your wife's friend, the lawyer, was more thorough than we initially believed. It appears he made additional copies of certain documents and stored them in multiple locations." Margaret felt her knees weaken as the implications hit her. James Harrison's death hadn't eliminated the evidence, it had only scattered it. The photographs and financial records that could destroy Richard's career and expose the Castellano family's operations were still out there, waiting to be discovered. "How many copies?" Richard asked. "We've located 3 separate caches so far, bank safety deposit boxes, a law firm's secure storage facility, and a private investigator's office. There may be others." Richard's eyes found Margaret across the room, and she saw her own death reflected in his gaze.
I see. And what do you recommend? We need to accelerate our timeline.
"The longer this information remains accessible, the greater the risk of exposure," Torino stepped forward, his massive frame filling Margaret's field of vision as he approached Richard's desk. "The wife is a liability that needs to be eliminated tonight, along with anyone else who might have access to the materials." Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward the pocket containing the panic button, but she forced herself to remain still. Showing any sign of desperation would only hasten whatever they had planned for her. "I understand your concerns," Richard said carefully, "but we need to consider the political implications. My wife's sudden death would raise questions that we can't afford to answer right now." "Your political career won't matter if those documents reach federal prosecutors," Castellano replied. "We've invested too much in your success to let everything collapse because of one woman's betrayal." Richard was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Margaret could see the calculation playing out behind his eyes, the value of keeping her alive for appearance's sake versus the risk of letting her continue to threaten their operations. "There is another option," he said finally. "A more permanent solution that would eliminate all potential complications." He walked to his desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing a document that Margaret recognized with growing horror. It was a will, already signed and notarized, leaving everything to Richard in the event of her death. "Suicide," Richard said simply. "Overwhelmed by grief over her friend's death, driven to despair by the pressures of public life." It would actually generate sympathy during the campaign. Margaret felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of Richard's plan became clear. He had been preparing for this moment for months, possibly years, laying the groundwork for her elimination while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. "The timing would need to be perfect," Castellano said, studying the document, "and we'd need to ensure that all copies of the evidence are destroyed before any investigation begins." "Leave that to me," Richard replied. "I know where to look." It was then that Margaret realized her fatal mistake. By meeting with James Harrison, by gathering evidence of Richard's crimes, she had inadvertently provided him with a roadmap to the very materials that were supposed to protect her. The panic button in her pocket felt like a useless trinket as she listened to the 3 men plan her murder with the casual efficiency of a business transaction. Even if help was coming, it might not arrive in time to prevent what was about to happen. But as Richard moved toward her with that familiar predatory smile, the office windows suddenly blazed with light from helicopters that had appeared without warning. Searchlights flooded the room as federal agents rappelled from the aircraft, their weapons drawn, and their voices shouting commands that cut through the night like salvation itself. Margaret threw herself behind Richard's desk as gunfire erupted throughout the office. Through the chaos, she heard Vincent Castellano screaming orders at his men, and Marcus Webb shouting into his radio for backup that would never come. The panic button had worked after all. James Harrison's final gift had delivered exactly what he had promised: federal agents, SWAT teams, and enough firepower to end Richard Ashford's reign of terror once and for all. As the shooting stopped and armed agents secured the office, Margaret emerged from behind the desk to find Richard on his knees, blood streaming from a shoulder wound, his perfect composure finally shattered. "Margaret Ashford," called a woman's voice. "I'm Agent Patricia Collins with the FBI. Are you injured?" Margaret looked around the office, taking in the destruction that marked the end of her 23-year nightmare. Richard was alive but wounded. Castellano and Torino were face down on the floor in restraints, and she was finally, impossibly, free. "No," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "I'm not injured. I'm ready to tell you everything." 6 months later, Margaret sat in a federal courthouse watching her former husband receive a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence she and James Harrison had gathered, combined with additional materials seized during the raid, had exposed a web of corruption and violence that reached the highest levels of state government. Richard never looked at her during the proceedings, but Margaret felt his presence like a weight she was finally able to set down. The woman who had lived in fear for so many years was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had survived the unthinkable and emerged with her dignity intact. As she walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunshine of a spring morning, Margaret Ashford smiled a genuine smile for the first time in decades. The performance was over, the audience had gone home, and she was finally free to discover who she really was beneath all the roles she had played. The golden gates of Westmont Estate stood empty now, their power to imprison her broken forever. Margaret drove past them without looking back, heading toward a future that belonged entirely to her. Behind her, the estate grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Just another relic of a life she had chosen to leave behind. Freedom, she discovered, felt exactly like coming home.